The lobby of the Grand Hyatt was a world unto itself, especially in the quiet hour just before dusk. The afternoon sun, now a soft honey gold, slanted through the tall, arched windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished marble floor. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into tiny, glittering stars. The air was cool and carried a faint, clean scent of lilac and expensive furniture polish. It was a space designed for hushed tones and respectful silences. A cathedral of comfort where the rustle of a newspaper page or the quiet clink of a coffee cup sounded like a significant event. In the center of this grand, still space sat the main character of this quiet afternoon, a gleaming black grand piano. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a piece of art, its polished surface reflecting the room's muted elegance like a dark, still lake. It sat on a small raised platform as if on a stage, patiently waiting. And for the past 10 minutes it had a player. An older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, sat on the velvet-topped bench. She wasn't a hotel employee. There was no uniform, just a simple, well-made wool coat in a deep shade of navy draped over the bench beside her. Her hair was a lovely silver, pinned up in a neat but not too fussy bun. A few stray strands had escaped to frame a face that was lined, not with age, but with the stories of a life fully lived. Her eyes, a soft, gentle blue, were focused on her hands, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. She was a guest, just waiting. Her husband was in a business meeting, one of those final conference calls that always seem to run long. She had grown tired of sitting in the comfortable but sterile armchairs, tired of flipping through magazines she had no interest in. And then she had seen the piano. It had called to her. It wasn't a loud or demanding call, but a quiet, magnetic pull from across the vast lobby. She had found herself walking towards it, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the marble. She had circled it once, her fingers hovering just above the keys, a ghost of a memory guiding her. It had been years, decades even, since she had sat at a piano like this without a specific purpose, without an audience to please or a lesson to teach. Finally, she had sat down. The coolness of the smooth wood felt familiar and comforting. She had lifted the fallboard, revealing the pristine ivory and ebony keys. They looked like old friends she hadn't seen in a very long time. And then she began to play. Her touch was hesitant at first, a shy greeting. The first few notes were simple, almost like a child's music box tune. They were clear and pure, each one a perfect droplet of sound that hung in the air for a moment before fading away. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation, a quiet secret shared between her and the instrument. Her fingers, though a bit stiff with arthritis, moved with a muscle memory that was deeply ingrained in her soul. They knew the way, even if her conscious mind had forgotten. The melody she coaxed from the piano was gentle and unassuming. It wasn't a famous classical piece or a popular show tune. It was something simpler, a tune that felt like it had been born from the quiet corners of her own heart. It was a little sad, a little hopeful, and deeply peaceful. It weaved itself into the fabric of the lobby, becoming a part of the atmosphere rather than interrupting it. A businessman in a crisp suit, his voice a low, urgent murmur into his phone, walked past without breaking his stride or his conversation. The melody was just background noise to him, a pleasant but irrelevant hum. A young couple, clearly tourists, were busy taking selfies in front of a large floral arrangement, their laughter and poses far more important to them than the quiet music. A bellman, standing respectfully by the entrance, let his gaze drift over to the woman for a moment. He offered a small, polite smile before returning his attention to the revolving doors. His thoughts on his next task, only a few people seemed to truly notice. An elderly man sitting in a nearby armchair, reading a book, lowered his volume and looked over, a look of fond remembrance on his face. A young mother, rocking a sleeping baby in a stroller, closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, a moment of peace in her hectic day. But for the most part, the woman and her piano were invisible, a beautiful, living piece of the hotel's decor that most people were too busy to truly see, and that was exactly how she wanted it. This was not for them. It was for her. It was for the memory of her mother, who had taught her to play on a rickety old upright in their small living room. It was for the countless hours she had spent practicing as a young girl, her dreams as big and grand as the concert halls she hoped to one day fill. It was for the joy, the frustration, the discipline, and the pure, unadulterated love of creating something beautiful out of silence. As she played, her shoulders relaxed and the faint smile on her lips grew a little wider. The gentle melody flowed from her fingers, a quiet river of sound in the vast, silent lobby. She was lost in her own world, a world of black and white keys, of harmonies and melodies, a world that was hers and hers alone. She was just a quiet woman at a piano, and in that moment it was more than enough. The world outside, with its noise and its hurry, had faded away, leaving only the music. The gentle melody continued to flow from the grand piano, a quiet river of sound in the vast, peaceful space. The woman with the silver hair was lost in her world, a world of memories and music, her fingers dancing lightly on the ivory keys. The lobby around her continued its slow, quiet rhythm, a world of comings and goings that paid her little mind. This delicate balance, this fragile bubble of peace, was about to be shattered. It started not with a bang, but with a burst of energy that felt completely out of place. A group of 4 young people, probably in their early 20s, exploded through the main entrance. Their laughter was sharp and loud, echoing off the marble walls and glass ceilings, a stark contrast to the hushed tones of the hotel. They were a splash of vibrant, modern color against the classic, muted backdrop. They wore expensive-looking sneakers that squeaked on the polished floor, designer hoodies, and carried the kind of restless energy that spoke of too much money and not enough to do. They moved with a careless confidence, as if the Grand Hotel and everyone in it were just a backdrop for their own personal movie. Their noise cut through the lobby's quiet hum like a knife. The businessman on his phone moved away, frowning. The young mother with the sleeping baby shot them a nervous glance. The bellman by the door stood a little straighter, his professional smile tightening slightly. The music from the piano, once a gentle presence, now seemed to be in a battle it was losing, its soft notes drowned out by the group's boisterous chatter. The leader of the group, a young man with a trendy, sharp haircut and a watch that looked far too expensive for his age, was the first to notice the woman at the piano. He stopped mid-sentence, his friends bumping into him from behind. A slow, dismissive smirk spread across his face. He nudged the guy next to him, a taller boy with a baseball cap pulled low, and gestured with his chin towards the small platform. "Hey, check it out," he said, his voice a loud stage whisper that was clearly intended to be overheard. "Grandma's got a recital going on." His friends chuckled and turned to look. One of them, a girl with perfectly styled hair, pulled out her phone, not to record, but to scroll through her social media, already bored. But the leader was intrigued. It wasn't the music that interested him. It was the opportunity. He saw the older woman, her posture focused, her simple coat draped over the bench. To him, she wasn't a person with a history. She was a prop, a punchline waiting to happen. He listened for a moment, his smirk growing. The melody was simple, sweet, and unassuming. It was everything he was not. "Seriously?" he said to his friends, his voice dripping with condescension. "My little sister plays that exact song. She's like 7. It's one of the first things they teach you in piano lessons for beginners." His friends laughed again, a chorus of easy cruelty. The tall one with the cap added, "Yeah, man, she's not even hitting all the notes right. Sounds a little slow." This was, of course, not true. The woman's playing was precise and filled with a gentle emotion they were incapable of understanding. But in their world, speed and complexity were the only measures of value. Anything quiet or simple was automatically dismissed as weak or amateurish. Emboldened by his friends' laughter and the sense of power that came from their pack mentality, the leader decided to escalate. He wasn't content with just mocking her from a distance. He wanted to be the center of the action. "Watch this," he said with a cocky grin to his friends. He straightened his hoodie, puffed out his chest slightly, and began to walk towards the piano. His sneakers squeaked with each step, a jarring, rhythmic sound that drew the attention of everyone nearby. The gentle music from the piano faltered for a beat, then continued, but the woman's shoulders had tensed ever so slightly. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, the approach of a disruptive force. The young man strode up to the piano and stood over her, his shadow falling across her hands and the keys. He loomed there for a moment, expecting her to stop and look up at him with fear or deference. She didn't. She finished the phrase she was playing, her fingers never missing a note. It was a quiet act of defiance that only made him more determined to break her composure. Finally, she let her hands come to rest on the keys, and the music stopped. The silence that fell was heavy and uncomfortable. She slowly lifted her head and looked up at the young man towering over her. Her eyes were a soft, clear blue, and they held no trace of the fear or annoyance he was hoping for. Instead, they looked tired, as if she had seen this kind of pointless arrogance 1,000 times before and was simply weary of it. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice laced with a fake, syrupy politeness that was more insulting than a direct insult would have been. He glanced back at his friends, who were watching with rapt attention, their phones now out and recording. He was performing for them. That's a nice little tune you've got there," he said, the word little hanging in the air like a tiny dart. "Really cute, very simple." He let out a small, dismissive laugh. "But I have to ask, do you actually know how to play? Like, for real? Or is that all you've got?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Her calmness was unnerving him. He had expected her to be flustered, to apologize, to say something like, "Oh, I'm just a beginner." Her silence was a wall he couldn't break. He pressed on, his voice losing its fake politeness and taking on a harder, more challenging edge. "I bet you couldn't handle something real. Something with a bit of speed, you know? Something that's actually difficult." He was desperate now to get a reaction, to provoke her into the confrontation he wanted. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet strength that cut through his arrogance. "I was just passing the time," she said simply. "I'm not looking for an audience." The young man's face flushed. Her dismissal stung more than any argument could have. She had just swatted him away like an annoying fly. His friends were still watching, and he couldn't back down now. He had to save face? Passing the time? "Right," he scoffed. "Look, lady, don't be shy. If you can play, then play. Impress us." He thought for a moment, trying to recall a piece of music that sounded impressive, something he might have heard in a movie or a video game. A name came to him, one that he knew was famous for being hard. "All right," he said, a triumphant look on his face as if he had just checkmated her. "How about that one, the fast one with all the bells? La Campanella, you know it? If you can play that, I'll shut up." He said the name with a flourish, confident that he had just named something so far beyond her abilities that she would have to admit defeat. He stood there, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face, waiting for her to make her excuses. The woman looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his arrogant, youthful face, at his friends behind him with their phones held up like weapons, and at the small crowd that was beginning to notice the confrontation. A deep, weary sigh escaped her lips. It was the sound of profound resignation, the sound of someone who had been enjoying a private moment of peace and now has to deal with a needless, ugly disruption. She saw no genuine curiosity in his eyes, only a desire to mock and humiliate. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The quiet, unassuming guest who just wanted to be left alone decided, perhaps for the first time in many years, to give someone exactly what they were asking for. "All right," she said, her voice suddenly losing its soft, gentle quality. It was still calm, but now it had a new edge to it, a core of steel. "Just one piece." She turned away from him and back to the piano. As she looked at the keys, her entire posture changed. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, and her hands, which had been resting so gently, now settled over the keys with the authority and confidence of a master. The gentle, unassuming woman who had been playing simple melodies had vanished. In her place was a focused, powerful artist ready to claim her space. The young man's smug grin began to falter as he watched her transform, a sudden, unwelcome flicker of doubt crossing his mind. The young man stood with his arms crossed, a final, triumphant smirk on his face. He had backed her into a corner, or so he thought. He had named a piece of music famous for its difficulty, a piece that even skilled pianists would hesitate to play on a whim. In his mind, the game was already over. He glanced back at his friends, expecting to see them admiring his cleverness, but their expressions were already starting to change. The tall one with the baseball cap had lowered his phone slightly, his brow furrowed in confusion. The girl was no longer scrolling through her social media. She was watching the woman at the piano. A flicker of something other than amusement in her eyes. The woman, for her part, seemed to have completely forgotten they were there. Her world had shrunk to the 88 black and white keys in front of her. She ran her fingers over the keys, not playing them, but just feeling them as if reacquainting herself with old friends. Her touch was light, reverent. It was the touch of someone who knew every secret the piano held. She took a deep, slow breath, and as she let it out, a subtle but profound change swept over her. The gentle, grandmotherly posture dissolved. Her spine lengthened, her shoulders pulled back, and her chin lifted just a fraction. It was as if she had just put on an invisible garment of power and confidence. The silence in the lobby began to change, too. It was no longer just the absence of the young man's loud voice. It was becoming a charged, expectant silence. The ambient noises of the Grand Hotel seemed to fade into the background. The distant clatter of dishes from the restaurant, the soft whoosh of the revolving doors, the murmur of the concierge's conversation, it all melted away. All that remained was the space around the piano, and it was humming with a quiet, building tension. The few people who had been casually observing now found themselves rooted to the spot, their attention captured completely. The bellman, who had seen countless guests come and go, found himself leaning against his podium, his professional demeanor forgotten. The businessman had ended his call and was now watching, his briefcase held loosely at his side. The young mother had turned the stroller fully towards the piano. Her own breathing quieted in anticipation. The young man's smirk began to falter. He had expected a stammered apology, an excuse, a quick retreat. He had not expected this quiet, intense transformation. He looked at her hands again, really looked at them. They weren't the frail, bumpy hands of an old woman playing a simple tune. They were poised, steady, and filled with a latent energy that was almost intimidating. The way her fingers curved, just above the keys, suggested a coiled spring, a predator ready to strike. He felt a strange, unwelcome knot of doubt tighten in his stomach. He tried to brush it off with another sarcastic comment. "Well?" "Any day now," he said, but his voice came out thinner than he intended, lacking the booming confidence he had just moments ago. The words fell flat in the heavy silence, sounding petty and small. The woman gave no sign that she had heard him. She closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, they were no longer soft and gentle. They were sharp, focused, and clear. They were the eyes of a performer, a master of her craft. She was no longer in the lobby of the Grand Hyatt. She was on a stage in a grand concert hall under a single spotlight. The audience, the noise, the world outside her music had ceased to exist. There was only her and the piano, and the symphony of sound that was about to be born. She adjusted her position on the bench, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes. It was the movement of someone making sure their foundation was perfect before unleashing a storm. Her left hand settled into position low on the keyboard, while her right hand hovered high above the keys, ready for the opening flourish. The air grew thick with suspense. It was so quiet now that you could hear the soft hum of the hotel's air conditioning, a low, mechanical drone that seemed to be holding its breath along with everyone else. The young man found himself holding his breath, too. His heart was starting to beat a little faster. He looked at his friends. They were no longer laughing. They were staring, their mouths slightly agape, their phones still recording but now capturing something far different than they had anticipated. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey, about to be devoured by a power they couldn't comprehend, and then it began. Her right hand descended. The first notes were not the simple, sweet tones from before. They were a cascade of crystal clear, impossibly fast notes that shot out from the piano like a shower of tiny, brilliant stars. The sound was not just loud. It was piercing, cutting through the heavy silence with a razor-sharp edge. It was a sound so precise, so technically perfect that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. Each individual note was a perfect pearl of sound, yet they came so fast that they blended together into a shimmering, liquid tapestry of music. The effect on the lobby was instantaneous and absolute. The young man flinched as if he had been struck. His eyes widened in disbelief, the smug arrogance wiped clean from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His friends took a collective, involuntary step back. The small crowd that had gathered gasped, a soft, unified sound of awe. That one opening passage, lasting no more than a few seconds, had told them everything they needed to know. This was not a hobbyist. This was not a retired teacher playing for fun. This was a virtuoso. They had challenged a quiet woman at the piano, completely unaware that they had just woken a sleeping giant. The first notes that exploded from the grand piano were not just music. They were a physical force. They shot through the hushed lobby of the Grand Hyatt like a bolt of lightning, electrifying the air and silencing every other sound. The young man who had issued the challenge physically recoiled, as if the sound had slapped him across the face. His jaw, which had been set in a smug line, was now hanging open in a perfect O of disbelief. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and small. His friends, who had been poised to laugh, were now frozen in place. Their phones still held up, but their faces masks of pure astonishment. The confident pack of disruptors had been instantly transformed into a stunned and silent audience. The woman's right hand was a blur of motion across the keys. It moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost inhuman, a whirlwind of fingers dancing on ivory. To the watching crowd, it was less like playing and more like a magic trick. The cascade of notes was so fast, so intricate, that it was hard to believe they were being produced by human hands. It was like watching a hummingbird's wings, a vibration so fast it becomes a blur. Yet you know it's creating the power to fly. Each note, however, was not lost in the speed. They were crystal clear, like a string of perfect tiny pearls being spilled onto a marble floor, each one distinct and ringing with its own pure tone. It was a sound of impossible beauty and breathtaking technical skill. While her right hand was a storm of activity, her left hand was the rock, the foundation upon which this magnificent structure was built. It moved with a powerful, deliberate grace, anchoring the melody with deep, resonant chords that provided a dramatic counterpoint to the flurry of high notes. The contrast was mesmerizing. The right hand was a light, shimmering waterfall of sound, while the left hand was the deep, steady river it flowed into. Together, they created a soundscape that was both delicate and immensely powerful, a complex tapestry of harmonies that filled every corner of the vast lobby, reaching up to the high glass ceiling and bouncing back with a richness that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The woman herself was the calm at the center of this storm. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of intense concentration. She was no longer the tired, quiet guest waiting for her husband. She was an artist, completely lost in her creation. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead, and a muscle twitched in her cheek, the only visible signs of the immense physical and mental effort this performance required. Yet she made it look effortless. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, a subtle, almost unconscious movement that showed she was feeling the music with every fiber of her being. Her silver hair, once so neatly pinned, now had a few more strands escaping, framing a face that was alive with a passion that belied her age. The piece she was playing, La Campanella, which means the little bell in Italian, is famous for a specific reason. Throughout the dizzying storm of notes, there were moments where a single, high-pitched note would ring out, clear and sustained, like a tiny, perfect bell being struck in a quiet church. The woman played these notes with a special kind of magic. She would land on the key with a feather-light touch, and the sound would hang in the air, shimmering and pure, before the cascade of notes would resume. It was these moments of delicate beauty that made the performance truly special. It wasn't just a display of speed. It was a story being told, a story of bells ringing, of light dancing, of a spirit soaring free. The lobby, once a place of transient business and quiet indifference, had been completely transformed. It was now an impromptu concert hall, and the woman at the piano was its star. People who had been on their way to meetings or dinners or their rooms had stopped in their tracks. A small crowd had gathered around the piano, forming a respectful semicircle. They stood in silence, their faces turned towards the music, their own worries and schedules forgotten. Hotel staff, from the concierge to the housekeepers, had paused their work to listen. Even the most jaded of travelers, the ones who had seen it all, were captivated. Phones were out, but they were no longer tools of mockery. They were now being used to capture a moment of pure, unadulterated magic, a story they would tell for years to come. The young men were at the very center of this transformation. The leader, the one who had been so arrogant and loud, was now utterly silent. He stood with his arms hanging limply at his sides, his phone forgotten in his hand. He was no longer performing for his friends. He was just another member of the audience, completely humbled and awestruck. He looked at the woman's hands, and for the first time he saw not an old woman, but a master craftsman at the peak of her powers. He saw the years of practice, the discipline, the sacrifice, and the sheer love that it must have taken to reach this level of skill. His earlier mockery now seemed not just cruel, but pathetically ignorant. He was a child who had laughed at a master swordsman only to see the sword drawn and realize he was in the presence of greatness. As the piece progressed, the music grew even more intense. The passages of speed became even more dazzling, the chords even more powerful. There were moments when the sound from the piano was so full, so thunderous that it seemed to shake the very floor beneath their feet. It was a sound that could fill a stadium, yet here it was in this quiet hotel lobby, filling the space with an overwhelming wave of emotion. It was a sound of triumph, of a life lived to the fullest, of a talent that refused to be hidden away. The woman was no longer just playing the piano. She was channeling something through it, something powerful and profound that touched everyone who heard it. The performance reached its climax. A final, breathtaking flurry of notes that seemed to defy all logic and reason. It was a sprint to the finish line, a final, brilliant display of everything she had. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Her fingers came to rest on the keys, and the final, powerful chord faded into a profound and echoing silence. The lobby was completely still for a long moment, the air still vibrating with the memory of the music. It was a silence that was heavier and more meaningful than any sound. It was the silence of a shared, breathtaking experience, the silence of an audience that had just witnessed something truly extraordinary. The final, powerful chord hung in the air of the Grand Hyatt lobby, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to have a life of its own. It didn't just fade away. It vibrated, echoing off the marble floors and glass ceilings, wrapping itself around the columns and seeping into the very fabric of the room. And then, as the last tremor of sound disappeared into silence, the lobby was left in a state of profound, almost sacred quiet. This silence was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the memory of the music that had just filled the space. It was full of the collective, held breath of every single person who had stopped to listen. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if they were all afraid to break the spell, to shatter the delicate, beautiful thing that had just been created. The young men stood frozen, their faces still masks of disbelief. The leader's phone, which he had held up to mock, was now dangling loosely from his fingers, its screen dark, completely forgotten. The world outside the lobby had ceased to exist. There was only the piano, the woman, and the ghost of the music that still lingered in the air. The spell was finally broken by a single, sharp clap. It came from an elderly man who had been watching from an armchair, his book now lying forgotten in his lap. The sound was clear and confident, a punctuation mark on the stunning performance they had just witnessed. It was followed by another, and then another, until a wave of applause erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping you might hear at a formal concert. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt, thunderous roar of appreciation. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. People who had been strangers moments ago were now united in their shared experience. Their faces turned towards the woman at the piano, their applause a way of saying, "Thank you," for the moment of magic she had just given them. The sound seemed to startle the woman. She blinked, her eyes slowly focusing as if waking from a deep trance. The intense concentration on her face softened, the fire in her eyes died down, replaced by the gentle, tired look they held before. The virtuoso, the powerful artist who had commanded the room with her music, was gone. In her place was the quiet, unassuming woman in the simple navy coat. She looked at the crowd that had gathered, at the smiling faces, at the hands clapping for her, and a faint blush rose to her cheeks. She seemed almost embarrassed by the attention, as if she had been caught doing something deeply personal and hadn't meant for anyone to see. She gave a small, almost shy nod to the room, a quiet acknowledgement of their applause. Then she began to close the fallboard of the piano, her movements slow and deliberate. The soft thud of the lid closing over the keys seemed to signal the end of the performance, both literally and figuratively. The spell was truly broken. It was in that moment that the young man who had challenged her found his legs. He stumbled forward, pushing past his friends who were still staring, dumbfounded. He walked towards the piano not with the arrogant swagger of before, but with the hesitant, clumsy steps of someone approaching a force of nature they no longer understand. His face was pale, and his earlier bravado had been replaced by a look of profound shame. The woman had just stood up from the bench, and was about to pick up her coat when he reached her. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking. The loud, confident tone was gone, replaced by a thin, reedy sound. We are so sorry." The woman stopped and looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't forgiving either. It was calm, patient, as if she were waiting for him to finish. I don't have words," he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "That was the most incredible thing I have ever heard in my entire life. I was an idiot. I was a complete and total idiot." He looked down at his expensive sneakers, unable to meet her gaze. "I was arrogant and stupid, and I had no idea. No idea at all. I don't know what I thought. I'm just so sorry." His friends had gathered behind him, their usual cockiness completely gone. They stood there with their heads bowed like scolded children. The leader looked back at them, then back at the woman, his eyes pleading for some kind of absolution. The woman looked at him for a long moment. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the deep humiliation that had replaced his earlier arrogance. She saw a young man who had just been taught a lesson he would never forget. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer, letting him feel the weight of his actions. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet strength that cut through the lobby's noise. "Talent is quiet," she said simply. "It's arrogance that is loud." The words were not a reprimand, but a statement of fact. They were simple, yet they held a world of wisdom. The young man flinched as if he had been struck, not by anger, but by the simple, undeniable truth of her words. He nodded, unable to speak. She didn't wait for more of an apology. She didn't linger to bask in their shame or their newfound respect. She simply picked up her coat from the bench, draped it over her arm, and gave another small, dignified nod to the room. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't make a grand exit. She just walked through the parting crowd, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the marble floor. She disappeared down a long corridor, leaving behind a stunned audience and a group of thoroughly humbled young men. The lobby slowly began to return to its normal rhythm. The applause died down and people started to move again, their voices a low murmur as they talked about what they had just seen. The businessman picked up his briefcase and continued on his way to his meeting. The young mother pushed the stroller towards the elevators, a smile on her face. The bellman went back to his post, but he kept glancing over at the piano, as if expecting the woman to return, but for the young men, the world had changed. They stood there for a long time, long after the woman had gone, just looking at the empty piano bench. The leader finally put his phone back in his pocket, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at his friends, and for the first time, he didn't see a pack. He saw 3 other individuals who, like him, had just been schooled in a lesson of humility they never knew they needed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They all understood. They had challenged a quiet woman at the piano, completely unaware that they were in the presence of a greatness that didn't need to shout to be heard. And in that grand hotel lobby, they had learned that the most powerful sounds are sometimes the ones you don't expect.